Hi, pretty little lifters. In this episode, I am joined by LA-based writer, performer, and four-time Emmy Award-winning television journalist, Cole Kazdin. Also, if you look in the background of our podcast video, you can see her Emmy. Excuse me. I was like, this is very fancy. I love it. Cole has written for Vice, Time, the New York Times, Los Angeles Magazine, Cosmopolitan, and so many other publications. And she has also produced for Good Morning America, Nightline, and World News Tonight. I just read her first book, What's Eating Us? Women, Food, and the Epidemic of Body Anxiety, that reveals disordered eating as an epidemic crisis, killing millions of women. And she also shares her personal experience with disordered eating. Cole has also performed storytelling all over Southern California, where she is a proud three-time Moth Grand Slam champion, and her solo performances have even gotten national praise and has been optioned for a film. And as a teacher, I really love this next thing about Cole. She leads workshops, classes at UCLA Extensions in their writers program. So if any of you are interested in learning to write or enhance your writing skills, check out UCLA Extensions, giving a little shout out there. Now let's welcome Cole to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Cole.
I'm so happy to be here.
And thank you for bearing with technical difficulties. Everyone, we were trying to get this going because I kept hearing myself, but we figured it out. Hopefully we will have a seamless recording. But thank you for taking the time to be here. And I would love it if you could share a brief intro of who you are, where you're from, and what you are up to.
Absolutely. My name is Cole Kazdin. I'm here in Los Angeles, and I'm the author of the new book, What's Eating Us? Women, Food, and the Epidemic of Body Anxiety. And I lift too.
Yes, we love lifters. You're an author, you're a writer, you're a journalist, you're a lifter. We love this. We love smart women here. This is amazing. So what inspired you to write your first book, What's Eating Us, as well as sharing your personal story in the book, because it is kind of like a personal narrative as well, and you mix in a lot of like what's currently going on. So what inspired this, and why is it important to you to have this out in the world?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I mean, my personal story has so much to do with what inspired writing the book, because I used to be a dancer. I used to be a dancer when I connect with the fact that on and off throughout my entire life, I struggled with some sort of eating disorder or disordered eating, but it has very little to do with the fact that I was a dancer. That's just a good place to have wind at your back to have those behaviors, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. But I did struggle with that, like so many women, whether it was dieting or straight up starving or compulsive exercising. And I eventually got treatment for that, but I never felt fully better. I was always questioning myself. I didn't feel cured. I didn't feel solid. I still felt weird around food. My relationship with exercise didn't feel regulated, I guess is the word. And I started reporting on some of these issues as a journalist, which is my profession and where most of my skills are. Maybe not in mental health care management, but in journalism. So I started seeing these patterns in my reporting when I started doing stories like, how hard is it to recover from an eating disorder? Do women of different ethnicities, different abilities, how do we all recover? Is there, I'm just going to rephrase that. Are there gaps in care? Are there injustices in care? Just really looking at the landscape of eating disorder treatment because I didn't feel like I was getting better. And I know that as a journalist, I could access people that I could never access as a patient. I could call the top researchers. I could ask them questions. Yeah. And so I set out to do that at first in short form reporting and then later in the book, where I set out partially to solve the mystery of my own incomplete recovery, but also to look at what are eating disorders, how common are they, are there treatments that work, and how can we collectively, even if a person doesn't have an actual eating disorder, feel better about our bodies, feel more powerful, feel stronger, and create community around that.
Yeah, no, as I was listening to your book, because it's also available in audiobook, and I'm glad that you read it. One of the things that was really interesting to me is, I teach physical education and I also teach health to ninth grade teenagers. And one of the things that was really interesting was I realized reading your book was the first time I've ever really listen to someone's story who has experienced an eating disorder, really hear their story in terms of just sure, I've been aware of somebody having an eating disorder and maybe you get glimpses, but reading it just shed so much knowledge to me as wow, this is what it could be like. I know that I've had students in the past who have struggled with this at such a young age, when they were 13, when they were 12, when they were 14. And so hearing this side of it from somebody who's experienced this, but it written out, and reading it, I was just like, wow, this is really powerful for people like me who are in fitness and healthcare and maybe who never have experienced this directly, to see what goes on with somebody.
Something we don't talk about nearly enough because there's so much shame around it. So you don't tell people. It's embarrassing. And so you end up kind of isolated. And then when you tell a story, share your stories, so many people, since I wrote the book, have, I get emails all the time from people who are 20 years old, 70 years old, people still struggling with this. I think it's just not named. And we hear so much about, especially now with Ozempic and all these weight loss drugs and obesity is so terrible. And everyone's so afraid of gaining weight that we don't treat eating disorders like the epidemic they are, which, the mortality rate is second to the opioid overdose, mortality rate. So it's something that is an epidemic. It's an epidemic. It's on par with the opioid epidemic.
Yeah. And it is really you name so many kind of mind-blowing statistics in your book. And I do think it's important for people to mention this. You mentioned disordered eating is killing millions of women. And like you said, I don't think we think about that. You think of it as maybe somebody isolated incidents. And then when I was reading your book and hearing these numbers, and even thinking about me as a teacher already, encountering 3 to 5 kids who have been dealing with this, and that's at a very small school.
Yeah. And then there's also the sort of more nebulous in between, I'm giving up gluten, which obviously if someone has celiac disease or an autoimmune issue where they have to give up gluten, that's separate. But here in LA especially, I have 3 friends who don't eat sugar, probably 10 that don't eat bread. None of it has to do with any health or genuine allergy. It's all in some indirect way connected to a weight loss goal, even if they're using the word health as proxy for that weight loss goal. And so that's not an eating disorder, maybe, but it can set you on the path. Food restriction can really set you up for going down that path.
Yeah. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because like I said, this isn't something that I have experienced firsthand, but what you mentioned, I have seen firsthand. And then I've started to dabble in when I started doing CrossFit and everything was paleo, and it was literally cutting out certain groups of food. And I was like, okay, I'll try it, and then I kind of saw how some people, started counting macros and got so into it that it led to disordered eating, and it became problematic. And they were like, I have to stop doing this. It's leading to some unhealthy patterns. And you would see it unfold before you. But it was ironic because we were, people were trying to do healthy things,
Yeah, those lines are so blurred. I mean, I'm an ex-CrossFitter too. And in that, in fact, I was in physical therapy for an injury, and everyone in my physical therapy, in the room, was like, oh, what box did you go to? Everyone was there for some sort of CrossFit injury. But I think in CrossFit, where I was it was really discouraged to talk about weight loss or your like if people started using that language, it was like, no, come on, girl, we got you. Like, let's lift heavy.
Yeah.
That, and I really appreciated that. Like, that kind of environment was really good for me. But it
Mm-hmm.
does also lead to that there are some, oh, now I'm just going to only eat sweet potatoes or whatever, that
Mm-hmm.
we have to just be careful and step out of
Yeah.
ourselves, I think, and look at that.
Yeah. It's like the pendulum like overweight, like overly swings one way, and then it's like trying to find its way back to like a nice little middle ground.
And for me, like in healing, exercise was the last piece of it for me, and something I still have conversations with myself about. Like today, I wasn't able to do what I consider a great workout, but I
Mm-hmm.
still moved my body, lifted a little bit, walked a little bit. It's fine, but I still have messages in my head about what counts as a workout, what's a
Yeah.
good workout, what, and to look at what your goals are if they're not going to be weight loss related, which for me, lifting really centers me on that. I lift just a couple
Mm-hmm.
times a week, but it when you're lifting heavy, you can't think about other bullshit.
Yep.
It really requires focus, and it helps actually steer me away from goals that aren't constructive for me.
Yeah, I totally feel the same way. I feel like when I'm there, I'm just so excited to see what my body can do that I'm not thinking of
Mm-hmm.
shrinking. I'm not thinking of how much do I physically weigh or my body fat percentage is like that's not what I'm thinking about. Like I'm literally thinking about like what I'm about to do with this weight. And it's interesting that you mentioned because I do think that this can sometimes fall into like when you're trying to perfect your exercise routine and maybe eating a certain way that possibly might lead to disordered eating. You mentioned how sometimes you would have an exercise or a workout day and you're like, this did this count, like was this enough? And I also used to feel that like there were times where like I would be like, oh, today I'm doing like a hot yoga class or like a Pilates class. And I'm like, was that even a workout? Did that count? Do I need to go do something else? And you do kind of get into that mindset, especially when you're used to doing like heavy things or something intense.
And I even, I interviewed a lot of experts for the book, and one of this really phenomenal researcher who is co-created an entirely new kind of treatment and therapy for eating disorders that I think really, really helped me, was kind of like that final getting over into recovery. I met with her several times, and finally at one point we got to the exercise part, and I said, can we just leave this one alone? Can exercise just be the one thing that I am messed up about, and I just have my own rule, and I have to wear the freaking watch and burn 400 calories or nothing counts, and can we just leave that one alone?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I wouldn't have said that if I really did want to leave it alone. But she
Yeah.
said, that's a compulsion. That's a compulsion.
Mm-hmm.
And let's think about that. And her advice, which was so helpful, is she said, think of what you can do on the worst day. The worst day meaning you're tired, you just got your period, you're in a bad mood, you're stressed, you have a lot of work. Like that's the worst day where it's the most difficult to exercise. What's the bare minimum? What would that be for you? Something you can do even on that day. And if you meet that, then you're kind of feeding the monster of the compulsion that says something needs to
Yeah.
count, you need to do something. And that has helped me so much. It was really constructive.
I like that because for some people, like a bare minimum could be like a 30-minute walk or like whatever it is, a yoga class or, and it's like having that marker of like helping somebody while they're, making shifts in their thoughts and thinking. Like, I think that's great. I think that's so awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we were talking about in your book, you mentioned disordered eating is killing millions of women. And what you mentioned this in the book, but let's share with everyone what gaps did you come across and that you saw in the standard care of when it comes to disordered eating, and how can healthcare/medical fields improve in this area? Because as a woman, we already know we are lacking in our healthcare. and
Yeah,
how we were being
seriously.
serviced in so many ways. But like now we have this other area of, people that need help in with eating disorders. Like what are you finding? Like what are these gaps? Like what needs to change?
Well, which is the biggest obstacle in this country right now is that there is no standard of care. Meaning, you show up to wherever, hospital, treatment center, therapist, and you're really in their hands. They can do whatever they want. Like if you break your arm roller skating, you go to the emergency room, they have to x-ray it, and if it's
Hmm.
broken, they'll put it in a cast. They can't like sing you a song. But in eating disorder treatment, they can sing you a song. So you're really relying on the particular therapist, doctor, clinician that you're seeing. And you have to do so much research to make sure that person knows the latest research and knows what they're doing. And the research is changing all the time. And you
Yeah.
need to see someone, one of the leading researchers in the world told me, if you go into a treatment center and they say everyone gets better, what we do works, run away.
Interesting.
Because that's not what the research tells us. The research tells us
Hmm.
that even with the best therapies, and there are great ones for kids and for adults, about half the people get better. The other half, the
Hmm.
treatment doesn't stick for them. So they have to try other
Yeah.
things. But there's a lot of I think very well-meaning people in the field who aren't practicing what has the best chance of working. But, other
Yeah.
countries have standards of care. Like in the UK, you can't give eating disorder treatment unless you're giving the evidence-based care, the most well-researched and scientifically backed, which again, still isn't a guarantee, but it's better than, I always use
Yeah.
horse therapy as the example. I love horses. They're lovely. I would love to pet a horse. I don't really think there's that much research to say that they can help an eating disorder.
Yeah. You also mentioned, I can't remember, I don't know if it was in the UK, correct me if I'm wrong. I can't remember where it was, but you were saying in the book that there are some hospitals that people with eating disorders, if they're having like a hard time, they can go there and they reserve certain beds for them. Tell me
Yes.
this. I was
Oh,
like,
I'm so glad you
what?
remembered that. This blew my mind. One of the researchers, she does a lot of research. She's a leading researcher in this country and Sweden and New Zealand. And she told me about a hospital in Sweden where the floor that treats eating disorders, they keep 2 beds empty at all times. Just 2 beds empty. And if someone is having a really hard time, they feel on the verge of relapse, they have relapse, they can call and go. And most of the patients that utilize this have been at the hospital before, maybe for
Yeah.
treatment, or they have a relationship with the doctors there. And you just show up, and it can be the example that Dr. Bulick, this researcher, gave me was your dog dies. You feel
Hmm.
terrible. You're having an awful day. You don't want to eat. You can't do it. Call the hospital. Oh, I'm just chill here. You go there.
Yeah.
They don't weigh you. They don't force you to eat. They watch you. You're there. They make sure you don't hurt yourself. They try to get you to eat if that's your eating disorder issue. But most patients, she said, are there for a few days or a week, and then they go home. And
Wow.
support is available, but not forced. And nothing's forced. And when you feel better, stronger, you go home. And that program has reduced the amount of emergency room visits for eating disorders in in
That's
Sweden.
so awesome.
In Sweden.
That is amazing. No, when I got to that part in the book, I was just like, shouldn't we have this everywhere? Like, this is great.
I mean, coming from this country, you can't even get your head around it. You can't even
Yeah,
get your head around it.
it is wild. And then when you said Sweden, I was like, oh, of course it was Sweden. Like, yes,
Of course,
like
Sweden.
I was like, of course it was there. And here's the thing: the way I think of that, like my example of that would be like at my school, I helped create a wellness room, and it's for students like if they're on the verge of a panic attack, if they're just having a hard time, and they
It's
just need a place
amazing.
to like go for a moment and like just spend 15 minutes or whatever they need to just like before like things escalate, it's like available. So it kind of reminds me of that. It's like, hey, here is
That's
this safe space for
amazing.
you, you know? Um, and I
And it
do think
also
sometimes that's all it
reduces,
needs.
and it reduces the stigma too, because you have a place to go. You're not like clawing to
Yes.
find a place to go. There's a
Yeah.
room. I mean, that
Yeah.
is really significant what you've done. I'll bet that's
Hmm.
helped so many people.
Yeah, it's been really good. But like, yeah, going back to like the hospitals and just thinking like it's so official, like it's like you have to go to the ER or the urgent care. Like, where do you go? And if there's not like you don't have an appointment or this, just because the way our healthcare system works, like
Yeah,
it
I mean,
is
it
so
is
nice.
so broken. And we saw during
Hmm.
COVID the amount of hospital admissions and pediatric hospital admissions and ER visits for eating disorders really skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And those have not gone back down to pre-pandemic
Yeah.
levels yet. So they're still really, really high. And there are a lot of correlations between eating disordered behavior and trauma, experiencing trauma. Obviously, even if a person had zero trauma of any sort in their life leading up to the pandemic, there's an immediate
Yeah.
trauma there. So we've really seen teenagers get really hit hard by this in the past couple of years, to the point where
Yeah.
I want to see the new set of statistics, because the ones I wrote just last year in my research in the book are probably all low.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's wild. And I mean, I have so many things to say about our our Medicare and our, medical and healthcare, but I think that just it's important for us to hear story because we're in our little bubble here in
Mm-hmm.
California, in the US, and you forget like, oh yeah, there's other countries doing things differently. And so when you hear stories like this, you're like, why can't we have that? It's just like we
Yeah,
should
that
have
it could
that.
look
Like,
another way. And
yeah.
what I think is so important is that it does actually help people be healthier. It puts
Yes.
people at less risk. And
Hmm.
I think that those numbers are important to know.
Yeah, 100%. In your book, you have a chapter called Why Doesn't Body Positivity Feel Better? And how has the idea of body positivity, so that's the name of the chapter. And I really liked this chapter because I remember when body positivity was all the rage. And I was also like, yes, body positivity. I want to
Yeah.
support all these women. But there has been a shift. And, I've seen it since, 2016, 2014, whenever it started, in terms of like when I started seeing it. So how has this idea of body positivity shifted over the last few years? Because I feel like if you're kind of in health and fitness and wellness, like you've seen the shift, but like for some people, they've just heard the phrase once and then they just know
Right.
that. So,
I mean, body positivity is the way we look at it now, I think it's such a tall order. Just immediately like your body. We have a backdrop of a culture that's just barraging us with weight loss and compulsive fitness messages and drugs and diets. And then we're also in the same breath being told, love yourself. For me, I was really trying to think about, why doesn't it feel better? Why can't I just like grab onto body positivity and just, get it, girl, you're beautiful. And it felt thin to me.
yeah,
And then I started digging into the laws and weight discrimination, and that weight is not a protected class, and that a person can be fired for being a particular weight. When you
yeah,
actually see laws that are on the books or not on the books, the absence of protections, well, that's why body positivity doesn't feel good, because a person in a larger body can love themselves and feel great and be fired for being fat.
yeah.
So body positivity doesn't give you much,
Hmm.
because it can't sustain you if, say, you're a person who doesn't, their body doesn't fit well in an airplane seat. Well,
Yeah.
you are just sitting there in the airplane thinking about how your body doesn't work in the world. So
Hmm.
that sort of, you're beautiful, get it, girl, like, doesn't matter.
Yeah. When I read this part in the book, that's why I was saying this chapter really stood out to me because I hadn't really thought of weight discrimination in terms of laws. And you started talking about, I think Michigan is a state that does have a weight discrimination law, right?
Hmm.
I think you mentioned that in your book.
Yes, and New York City just passed. This just the city, not the state, but New York City just passed
Yeah.
weight and
And
height discrimination.
yeah, and I do think that's really interesting because I can totally see what you're saying. It's like for us to say body positivity, but then knowing that there's some people out there who are getting fired from jobs or not getting hired from jobs or not being considered for certain things because of their weight, that is problematic, you know?
And it makes sense that you would then feel you don't really belong in the world because
Hmm.
the world's not built for you. You can't find a decent sweater in your
Yeah.
size, so I really think we have to change the way we look just culturally at all bodies.
Hmm.
And I think there's such a focus on what they call the obesity epidemic in this country, and I think a misplaced focus that really blames people
Hmm.
as if they're doing something wrong, and then they go on all these drugs. I mean, that's a whole other episode. I won't go down the
Yeah.
Ozempic road, but I think if we just started by saying all bodies are good bodies, all
Hmm.
bodies are good bodies,
Yes.
um, and had the laws to support that. Because if
Hmm.
we look at something like exercise, right, just obviously I'm going to be excited to talk about that with you. A lot of people in larger bodies don't want to go in a gym, don't want to work out. There may not be like a towel in the gym that works on their body, right? Like basic stuff.
Yeah.
But exercise, there's so much research on this. You probably know much more than I do. Exercise is so great for your physical health and your mental health, whether you lose weight or not. If you exercise every
100%.
day and do not lose a pound, you are going to be healthier. But I mean health by its meaning of free from disease or less at
Yes.
risk for disease, right? So
Hmm.
I would love to see exercise framed more like that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you also
No, I
get
absolutely
stronger,
love
have
that.
mobility. All of those things are benefits too. But the real, inner, your, blood going through your veins kind of benefits are really, really tangible.
Yeah. Another thing that you mentioned in your book that really caught my eye because I had a couple of my students talk about this in health class when we were talking about, disordered eating was that they were saying, like people of color, like BIPOC experience eating disorders too. Like this isn't just for white girls and white women. And you made a point to bring that up. And I'm really glad that you did.
Yeah, I mean, these, by some measures, BIPOC are twice as likely to suffer from bulimia or binge eating disorder, and yet half as likely as their white counterparts to be diagnosed and treated. I spoke with
Yeah.
many Black women for the book who would say, "Oh, my doctor was just so happy I was thin. My doctor was happy my
Mm,
blood pressure was good. No one ever asked about eating disorders." And they were
yeah.
suffering. They were suffering. They had all the symptoms. And I think we have to sort of reconfigure the way we think about eating disorders in our mind because they really are seen as a young white woman's disease. And it's not true at all. They're in every single community. I was looking at
Yeah.
the AAPI population, and there are only, I think, 2 or 3 studies even looking at that population with eating disorders, and
Wow.
hundreds on white women. So we need more research if we really want to
Hmm.
understand the scope of the problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And it is important to acknowledge. And like, this is something like, as I was reading your book, it just coincided perfectly with the timing of me talking about this with my students. And we kind of did dive into this and we're like, we have this picture of what people probably because what we see in the media, like if you're watching a movie and somebody has an
Absolutely.
eating disorder, like sometimes they look a certain way,
Of
and
course.
we talked about how it was really important to, change that lens because this is something that affects everyone. It can affect
Hmm.
everyone and it's not just one type of person. um
Yeah.
so one thing that I kind of wanted, your advice with, and I know there's probably a lot of other people out there who don't have experience with disordered eating. And one of the common things, even like my students have asked, is like, what do you do as a friend or a loved one if you suspect someone you know experiencing disordered eating? It's like, how should you approach the topic or offer support? Like, do you say something? Is it rude? Like, these are a lot of the questions that I get. And it's like, you care, you want to say something. And then, some of the questions I also get asked are like, do you have to be super close with them? What if it's an acquaintance? Like, what are the rules or
Yeah.
how can we support?
I mean, first I want to say that sometimes you can look at someone and see if something's going on, but most of the time you can't tell if someone has an eating disorder from looking at them. There are people in larger bodies who struggle with anorexia. They just haven't lost the amount of weight that we think of when we think of anorexia, but
Yeah.
they are forcing themselves into what for them is a smaller body, but to our culture at large, they might look like they're in a larger body. Only 6% of people with eating disorders are medically underweight. So
Interesting.
we don't know from looking at someone. So I think the way to approach it is to check our own behaviors and what we say to ourselves and other people. If we have any food restriction going on, to not do that anymore. If we are on a diet, to stop. We don't compliment weight loss. We don't observe weight gain. We do our very best for ourselves to eat all foods when we're hungry, try to check in with ourselves and our own behaviors. I think that's the best thing we can do, because we just don't know what's happening with someone else. And we can't really comment on someone's body. We can have conversations, but we don't want to, unfortunately, no one's going to try to get better until they're ready. And so we can just be there for them and love them. And maybe if we need an activity, if we're that type of person, I'm that type of person, to start researching and educate ourselves about it, find out where one day, if they come to you and say, I think I'm ready, you can say, here's 3 things I researched, here's 3 therapists, or whatever, right? So quietly, without offering it up, do some research, do some homework, and don't push it, don't suggest it. But when they're ready, you're going to be the loving person that they don't feel judged by, that they're going to talk to. And that's all you can do. That's kind of all you can do.
Yeah. No, this is so important that we're talking about this, because, I have a lot of students that I know that like they want to help, they see something happening, but you brought up such a good point. And you did mention this in your book too, is like, we have this conception of like, they have to be extremely skinny or thin, or like something's going wrong. That's when people usually are like, red flag, what's happening here? Like, so-and-so drastically has lost weight, like something's wrong. You're used to seeing them this size, now they're this size. But you brought the valid point that like people in larger bodies also have disordered eating, and you wouldn't be able to tell unless you were with them all the time and you started seeing maybe they don't eat very much, maybe that you just start noticing some habits perhaps.
And for people who, many people who suffer from binge eating disorder, it comes out of a cycle of restriction. So they'll say, oh, I'm intermittent fasting, or I'm not going to eat all day. And then their body is demanding food at the end of the day. And that's when they binge. So it's that idea of restriction. If we can not restrict, and not restricting doesn't mean binging. It doesn't mean eating everything in sight. It means not cutting out a food group, not cutting something in half because you think you shouldn't eat it, not because you don't want to eat it. We want to tune in as much as we can with our hunger.
Yeah, no, that's great. On that note, what advice would you share with your teenage self and teens today?
I love that question so much. I love it so much because it just brings you back immediately, right?
Yeah.
And I think what I would say is that you know more than you think. You have more answers than it feels like right now. Because I remember being a teenager and thinking, oh, this feels wrong. Oh, no, but everyone else says it's right. You know, there's that whole vibe
Yeah.
where something doesn't feel good and you kind of think, well, maybe I'm wrong. Usually you're not wrong. And when you're a teenager, it's such a great time to, if you can, connect with that gut, that inner voice. And I think you just have a lot more answers than you think you have at that age.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I totally agree with you. Like I even think back to when I was a teen, and like you said, like we doubt ourselves in this, and it's like, no, you knew the thing. You knew
You
what you
knew the
wanted to do.
thing.
You knew
Yeah,
what didn't feel right.
totally.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. So cool. How can we support you? Where can we direct people? How can people get their hands on your book?
Oh, thank you. I mean, you can get the book, What's Eating Us, wherever you buy your books. And I'm on Instagram at Cole Kazdin, and my website is my name. And I always love hearing from people. So if anyone has any questions, like, do not hesitate to get in touch.
I love that. Thank you so much, Cole, for taking the time to talk with me. And I think it is so important that you wrote this book and that you're sharing your story and this topic and your experience. And I appreciate you. You are so talented, and I appreciate what you are doing.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so great to talk to you.
And I will share all of Cole's socials and links and some links to the books in the show notes so you can check it out. I highly recommend the book. I enjoyed listening to it. And thank you all for listening. And I will talk to you next episode. Bye.